So, Todd McGowan, once again, thanks very much for joining me on the Hermitix podcast.
Oh, James, thanks so much for having me again. Always my favorite place to come.
We're going to be discussing the work of David Lynch, somewhat in memoriam, because he passed away 15th January, so this month, this year. Hopefully people watching a video that's going to be titled The Work of David Lynch will know who David Lynch is, so I don't need to introduce him. But also, in 2007, you published The Impossible David Lynch, published by
Yep.
Columbia University Press, which is a collection of essays on David Lynch not a collection of essays, but each chapter is on a single film, and obviously goes up to a certain point, it being 2007. So I want to begin with, what's your history with Lynch? Where did you... So I hate to mention this because it's kind of a rude thing to say, but you're 57, I think. Is that?
Yeah, 57.
The only reason I mention that is because you're a film scholar, so I'm intrigued as to where you started with Lynch, and also what the lynchian releases look like in film culture throughout time, if they really hit in that way for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was too young for Eraserhead, so I was only 10 when Eraserhead came out, so it didn't mean anything to me. I'd even heard of it. And I don't think I saw Elephant Man, and I don't even think I saw Dune. So Blue Velvet was really the first Lynch film that I saw, and I really thought it was amazing. And I thought, wow, this guy, it's so unusual. I was in college, and it was just something so different than anything I had seen. And my friends and I, shows you how backward I was. We would quote Dennis Hopper all the time about that line about Heineken, and we drank Pabst Blue Ribbon all the time just because of Dennis Hopper. So there was that. And then I watched Wild at Heart, and it was one of the only films I ever turned off. So I watched it in graduate school, and I hated it, and I turned it off.
Okay.
And then I watched Fire Walk with Me before I saw Twin Peaks, which is a weird thing to do. And that really, I was like, wow, there's something really going on with this guy. But then really my career basically as a film theorist, which I now don't see myself as, but at the time that was what I did. And it basically began with Lost Highway. And I saw Lost Highway at a multiplex in California. And I came out of it and I'm like, oh my God, I got to write it. And so I started to work on an essay like in the car, like as I was leaving. And in fact, my spouse, who's also a film scholar, I walked out and I said, oh, it's so clear that the mystery man is the superego. And she's like, can you just stop with that? Can you just let the film sink in a little bit? Just don't immediately start to theorize it. And then that was the first essay. And I remember that I wrote the essay, I sent to this journal, which was the top film journal, Cinema Journal at the time. And I thought, well, there's no way they're going to take it. And they took it, but they said, you don't really talk about the film as a film at all. You're not acting like a film, which was fair at the time. I was like, oh, they suck. They're these elite film. But of course they were right. Like, I didn't mention any of the formal aspects of the film, which are by far the most interesting things. So that started it. And then the book came out of, Hillary was in Vermont. I was in Texas, teaching in Texas. And I'm a terrible insomniac, so I couldn't sleep. And I had seen Eraserhead multiple times. And I thought, well, I couldn't sleep. I'll put on Eraserhead. It's so boring. I'll fall asleep for sure. I mean, I loved it, but it's like an Italian neorealist film. It doesn't keep you up. But it did. And I'm like, oh my God. And I had the whole idea for the book, right from watch that middle of the night watching Eraserhead. So, and then my experience of the later Lynch was like a straight story. I just went right to see it, like the day it opened. Mulholland Drive. I was living in Vermont. It didn't show here. So Hillary and I got in the car on a Friday, the day it opened, and drove to Boston, 3.5 hours away to see the opening. So I think that's true about a lot of people, that these later films really had I think starting with Lost Highway and then straight story, Mulholland. And then Inland Empire, I think, is a disappointment, but it had the same kind of initial fervor about it. But I think other people that are younger than me felt with blue already with like Blue Velvet and Wild at Heart that this was. I've now changed my view on Wild at Heart.
Okay, I did want to jump back. Do you remember where you stopped it the first time?
I do. It was when it was when Diane Ladd's face is all painted. She puts lipstick all over her entire face. You remember that scene?
Yeah.
Like, this is ridiculous. This is nothing to this, I thought.
Yeah, you really have to lean into this, the release of the fire in that film, right? You have to, if you get it's absurd. It's
absurd, right? I mean, I think I still don't think it's like one of his best, but I think it's got a lot going for it.
So what was it? Can you put your finger on what was it you saw that you felt, I haven't been seeing this in cinema at that point?
Well, I think what it was the way that he, and I think this is true in Lost Highway more than anything. It became most apparent to me in Lost Highway, was the way that he like created two like totally separate worlds. I think he called it in Lost Highway a fugue. He created these two separate worlds which were utterly distinct, and then there were these moments of collision where the worlds collided. And then I was just rewatching Dune. I had my students watch Dune because I think Dune is wildly underrated and just an absolute masterpiece, which is a total Minority Report, I know. And it's the same thing. Like there are these moments where like the desert planet, all of a sudden the rain comes to the desert planet at the end of the film. And I just think, I really love the idea of the miracle. And I think Lynch is a filmmaker of the miracle. And I think the way he does that is he creates these two totally distinct worlds cinematically, and then shows these moments when they collide. And then this miraculous thing happens that shouldn't be able to happen according to the rules of either of those worlds. So I feel like that's, to me, I mean, there's other, I guess, filmmakers that come close to that. Like I think of like Wim Wenders, maybe Alain Resnais, maybe, but not as consistently, I think. Like them, I would just choose, I think there's a few films, like Tarkovsky, a few films, but I think Lynch does it consistently throughout his career. So I think he's really the most, if you think that Christianity is consonant with the miracle, he's the most Christian filmmaker we've ever had, I think.
Could you loosely put signifiers to those two worlds, or would that be too...
So the two worlds in Lynch's film.
Yeah, or would that be?
Yeah. I think. I mean, I do.
Would that be too much?
No. In the book, I do. I say like one is a world of desire, and desire in the sense that we're stripped away from everything that seems like it would provide us satisfaction. Like we're just everything is completely barren. Like the Arrakis, this barren desert planet. But more in Lost Highway, like Fred Madison. There's no like. He lives in a world like his house has dark like passages in it where it seems like there are voids like in the house, and his spouse, played by Patricia Arquette, who also plays the girlfriend of Peter Dayton later in the film, but she's completely opaque. Like there's no sense of what she wants or anything. So he's stuck in this world of total desire without any what I would call phantasmatic resolution of that. And then the other world is this world where it's just like a world of total excess and fantasy, and you get everything that you could possibly want, although it's also very dangerous because when you get everything you want, you find, well, you don't really get it. I mean, that's one of Lynch's point. But that's why we had the great scene in Lost Highway in the desert. This is one of my favorite scenes in Lynch, where if you watch this in the cinema, and this is one of the sad things about home video and phones and things, that if you watch Lost Highway in the cinema, when Peter Dayton and Alice have sex it's Balthazar Getty and Patricia Arquette, when they're having sex in the desert in front of the car lights, you cannot even watch the screen. Like it's so bright in the theater that you have to you just can't. It's like you're looking at it. It's like you're staring at the sun. And then he's like, I want you, I want you, I want you. And then she stands up and goes, you'll never have me. And it's this great, so it's this great thing. Like even in the midst of our fantasy where we think we're going to get what we desire, Lynch shows us that we don't actually get it. So that's what I would say. It's like a world of desire and a world of fantasy.
Okay. I mean, to put forward a possible bridge between those worlds, because because Lynch, I guess, tweaks this idea. He's always in dialogue with this idea, which is the normal and normality. Yeah. So to sort of, I guess, ground what I mean by that would be in I think all of Lynch's films except Wild at Heart, he has the quick opener, like usually like a minute. So with Eraserhead, it's the levers and the causation thing, which you point out as a strange element of causation. In Elephant Man, it's the stampede of elephants.
Yep.
In Mulholland Drive, it's the dancing. But Blue Velvet, sort of probably one of the most famous Lynchian scenes, is this scene of the slow draw of hyper-normal American life, the bright red fire truck, the Dalmatian, the watering the lawn. I'm missing a couple of little things, but you're given
the flowers for sure.
Flowers, and you're given a view of normality that is so normal you feel sick, and the disaster that is normality is revealed to you. And so the bridge between these two worlds seems to be an engagement with. This is complete. Like Lynch is literally. I mean, in one interview, he says something like, "Cinema is just pointing the camera at things and saying like that's what you're going to look at." And that seems to be all he's doing is finding a normal scene and pointing a camera at it. And for some reason, the normal is revealed to be non-normal. And so what do you think of this paradox in Lynch that the normal isn't normal, but he completely is reliant on the normal to work?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right what you say. That he's like, and I once said this. I mean, I said this in the book that he's a bizarrely normal filmmaker, because I think if you do what you just said, like if you focus so intently on the normal, its bizarreness becomes evident. And I think what we do is we don't focus on it enough. I think we look at it a little bit, and then we kind of like look at something else. And I think what Lynch does is what you're like, he really looks at the grass and goes down into the grass. And then you're like, wow, okay, that's disgusting. And so I feel like and even you're right, like even the scenes before we get the camera diving into see the insects beneath the grass, even those scenes are really disturbing because they're so excessively normal. And so to capture that excess of the normality, I think is really pretty great. I mean, he used to say, he'd say, oh, my autobiography is I'm an Eagle Scout from Missoula, Montana. I mean, he just like, he like really played into this like normal aspect of himself, which I think is great, because I think it's kind of easy to play the pervert who goes against, like always sort of tries to go against whatever the law is. But it's I think a much more radical act to see the way in which the normal itself has this perversion at the heart of it, right? Like I think that's the really radical act, and I think that's why he's almost singular as a filmmaker, and why so many people have come since he died. So many people have expressed so much, have lamented and have just said, wow, what a tragedy this has been.
Yeah, I mean, there's something sort of Zizekian as well in that his sort of abeyance with normality, because you point this out in the book, and it sort of made me laugh when you did point it out, because you notice it, but you don't notice it about David Lynch, which is he always has his top button done up, which is like like a schoolboy, right? And it's like the Zizek thing of the teacher joining in with throwing rocks through the window. Like Lynch is sort of saying, like, well, if that's the rule, I'm going to obey it to the degree that it becomes weird to even obey it anymore.
It's Slavoj's notion of overconformity. I think that's what Lynch really embodies, right? Like it's tempting to say, I wonder what Slavoj would say about this, that like he as a thinker was kind of made possible by Lynch as a filmmaker. Like I think so much of what he thinks, like that notion of overconformity as a radical act, for sure. The notion of that every ideology, I mean, this is maybe his main political contribution, that every ideology functions with an obscene underside that really gets it to take a hold of people. Like that's an utterly Lynchian idea. Like think about all those figures of the obscene underside of ideology, like Frank Booth, Mr. Eddie, Mystery Man. Like they're all these obscene figures that really kind of hold the Lynchian universe together. And or the Carnival Barker from Elephant Man. He's probably if you had to choose, he's probably the worst of them, just for the horror that he inflicts on Merrick.
And I guess the sort of common thread throughout Lynch's films is either you have the death of the father figure at the beginning of Blue Velvet, of course, with the stroke, and no one's really pointed out that the hose is basically a phallus with the dog.
Absolutely,
right. Like,
I mean, it's one of the most obscene scenes of history.
It's depraved, and here's the quintessential father, and then we zoom into but also, okay, so there's like the classical father figure has died, and then in the other films, okay, you get a father figure, but who is it? Right, it's Frank Booth.
Right, it's Frank Booth, or it's Baron Harkonnen, and then the one kind of good father figure we have is Anthony Hopkins in Elephant Man. But then he has this great moment where he turns to his spouse and he's like, I always say this all the time after I've done something terrible. I say to Hillary, I'm like, am I a good man or am I a bad man? And of course the answer is he's a bad man. I mean, like, he's done exactly what the Carnival guy did, even though he rescued Merrick from the only character in that film that treats him with humanity is the actor, Ms. Kendall, that she's the one who really kind of sees him, who says, no, you're not a monster, you're a Romeo to him. Like, I think she really kind of sees him.
Yeah. I mean, it's a notion of maybe I'd throw in as well, the first time we don't see Merrick for 30 minutes in the film outside of this voyeuristic, like a shadow, or he's in the dark, like
he's got the thing over
He's got the thing over him, and as viewers, we're kind of like, I mean, it's almost masturbatory, because Lynch is making it clear, like, you want to, without being crass towards the real life Merrick, you want to see the freak, but I really win. So it's just in relation to your comment about the other person who treats him with like dignity. The first person who sees him as when we see him, so the nurse. I wonder if she does, but there's that sort of stain left, right, from the nurse, because she's screamed and like dropped the plate, and she eventually sort of warms to him. But
she does.
But that's another film that relies on a concept of normality that the split, once again, the very clear split between the two worlds.
Absolutely. And I think what's so great about that is it shows that normality can actually be radical, right? Like, he wants to be normal. Like we think like, oh, normal, it's this constraint. It's like, oh, I want to do everything I can to not be normal. But Merrick, he dies just to sleep like a normal person does. Right? Like, that's the end of the film. He gives up his life because I just want to sleep like a normal person does. I think it's just such a brilliant gesture on Lynch's part, because I think we really, I mean, maybe now, given, especially in America, given how we're seeing how abnormal things can become, I think it's interesting to see normality as, in the Lynchian sense, right, as something we should think of as a positive thing, not as a negative thing.
Well, I think so. And I mean, I think, just to stay on the topic of normality, I mean, I think this is what Lynch is possibly referring to when he says in another interview that The Straight Story was his most subversive film. So he said he's gone beyond the hypernormality of Blue Velvet to the point where we're back in normality, and you have to deal with the sincerity of The Straight Story for what it is, because it's like, that is completely not sincerely normal, right? Like,
it's sincerely normal, and it's also absolutely not cynical, right? Like, I think that's the other thing that I think people like about Lynch. And by the way, it's interesting because Slavoj agrees with Lynch about that. He thinks Straight Story is his most ethical film, and I'm not sure if I think that, but I do think it's right that it really just totally abandons any kind of cynicism about what, I mean, I think most people would laugh at what this guy is doing, right? Like, it's very hard to make a film about a guy driving his tractor 300 miles to see his brother and not think like, that's kind of dumb. Why don't you just get on a bus? You know, like it just doesn't, it seems dumb. And so I feel like his refusal of cynicism is what makes him, again, such a filmmaker that is so urgently needed. And I think that's why people have felt his loss so tremendously.
Do you think that's why he was able to bridge independent and mainstream cinema so well? Is because he's somehow doing films that would ultimately think this could very easily fall into the most pretentious thing imaginable, but it never does.
It never does.
No.
And I also think it is interesting, right, that he didn't. I mean, he started out with Eraserhead, and you can imagine a career like Stan Brakhage or something, you know, like where he just kind of stayed in that world. And he gets offered to make Elephant Man, which is going to be a mainstream film, and he just takes it. And then he got offered to make Return of the Jedi. And that would have been interesting, but he is like, no, you know, Lucas has already set up what it's got to be, so I can't operate with it. But then he took Dune, and his budget was the highest budget anybody had ever had for a film. So it's odd to think of an independent filmmaker who would take that kind of, just to accept that kind of budget, right? Because you know there's going to be constraints, and he buckled at those constraints, and he never, but he kept on, like he made Twin Peaks obviously for television. He was going to make Mulholland for television till the funding fell through. So yeah, I think I think you're right. He really was able to bridge that gap, and I think it's because he's not cynical. He's not, and again, I think it's this relation in normality. He doesn't feel like, I don't think he feels like an outsider. I don't think he wants to cultivate the position of the outsider. And I think that's very, very important. And I think that's a real danger to me for both artists and for leftists, is to kind of cultivate this position of the outsider and to feel like, oh, I'm this kind of superior minority outsider and I don't have anything to do with this mainstream thing. And I think it's a comfortable position, but I don't think it's an effective one. And I think Lynch changed a lot of people's lives because he didn't do that.
Because he didn't cultivate.
He didn't do. Yeah, he didn't do that. I mean, he wasn't afraid to take up the insider position. And I mean, it's just too bad. It's interesting. It's an interesting counterfactual, I think. Don't you think that, like, if Dune had been successful, then what would I think he would have been like the best version of Stanley Kubrick, right? Like the best, like better, but like that. Like Kubrick because you think like what Kubrick had, you could never have anymore. Because after 2001, he basically said, you send me money and I'll tell you what I'm doing if I want to, right? Like he just had utter control and power, right? And I think if Dune had been successful, that might have been the case for Lynch. And then I think it would have been interesting what he did. And I think Kubrick did some great things, but I think Lynch would have done even, like, I don't think money made him a worse filmmaker. Like, I think Christopher Nolan a lot of times suffers from like too much money. I think hurts it. Like, I think his best film is The Prestige, and I think it was made for much less money. I think Memento is very good. I think like these Batman ones and Oppenheimer, I think that with some filmmakers, more money can really have a deleterious effect on their filmmaking. But I think with Lynch, I don't think that would have been true.
Well, I don't know, where are you on the Twin Peaks: The Return? Are you?
I like it. I think it's, so for me, just to lay all my cards on the table, like I think Fire Walk with Me is Lynch's greatest achievement. Okay. And I think The Return has some moments that are amazing, but I think it's too long, and I think the Dougie stuff is just unacceptable. Like it just lasts way too long. But I think certain episodes, like I think episode 16 and 17, I think are as good as anything Lynch has done. So I'm kind of mixed on it.
Okay. I only asked that because I think he had a fairly big budget for that, right?
Yeah, he did for sure, from Showtime. And I think the other thing I would say is I think that that scene where the kid gets run over in that, film. I think in that series, I think is one of the greatest and most horrifying because it's one of those things. It's like a very Hitchcockian thing where, Hitchcock said suspense is where the audience knows what's going to happen and then they're just waiting for it to happen.
Yeah.
And that's exactly true in that scene. You have like 3 minutes where you you see the kid playing and you see this guy and you're like, I know it's going to, and it's just brutal. So I think there's some really great things. And I think Naomi Watts I think her performance in Mulholland, everyone she says, think I was going to go back to Australia. Lynch saved my career. He saved my, I think almost the opposite. I mean, of course that's true.
Yeah.
But I think Naomi Watts, thank God that she came to Lynch. I think it's the greatest. I know this is going to sound like hyperbole, but I always hyperbolize. But I think it's the greatest performance anybody's ever given on film. Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive. I think it's just unbeatable, and I think she's great in The Return as well. And I think she kind of, in many times, she saves that and saves some of those Dougie sequences just because she's so amazing.
Mm. I wanted to jump back to suspense because in our last conversation, actually, you mentioned, once again, to bring in Zizek, says the ideology of Hollywood is when you stop the film.
Yeah.
Maybe we can reduce that a little bit because it's this whole notion of suspense with this running over scene. It made me think of the funeral scene in Twin Peaks, which is arguably a scene that goes on not just too long, but way too long, right? So it's not stopped. This whole mixture of tragedy, suspense, horrible comedy, and
horrible,
and sort of some strange eatable thing going on as well. While there's this, the sound mixture of this horrible, I guess like a coffin jack, right? A gearing in your ears, and this just goes on.
Yeah.
And you're made to sit there and you go through about 4 different emotions. And Lynch seems to do this consistently where he says, I'm just going to stay with this. What do you think? I mean, it's an abstract question, but what zone is he taking? What are we having to confront? Because that's the Lynchian arena, right? Is that space. What is it we're confronting as a viewer?
Yeah, I think that's James, such a great question and such an amazing scene. I think you're right. And I think what we confront there is you're forced to, I think most of the time, let me say this in a non-crude way, but you have sex and then you turn over and go to sleep, right? In other words, you get what you want and then you're like, okay, I'm out of here, right? And I think what Lynch does is say, okay, no, you get what you want and then you get to stay with what you wanted for way, way, way too long. So you have sex, you have to look that person in the eyes for the next 30 minutes, right? I'd be unbearable. All of us would say, no, it's just even if you don't want to turn over, you still want to just let's cuddle and not have to look at each other. So I think that he's forcing us to look that person in the eyes for a long time. And that scene is, and even the comedy, you can't keep laughing, just like you're saying, because there's all these other things going on. And so, it's hard. It's initially kind of moving scene. And then because even Bobby is moved, everybody is moved, and then it's just absurd. And then, I think it just I think that again, that's another thing that Lynch does is he brings together emotions that we want to keep apart. And I think that's another part of this bizarre normality of him as a filmmaker.
But also he forces us back to Blue Velvet. So I found actually, because I was I'm talking to Todd about Lynch. I'll rewatch Lynch this week every night. And I found I actually couldn't because they're kind of too much. I did about 3. But so Blue Velvet's on my mind. And the scene that kind of made me laugh in terms of that relationship with what you mentioned about how Lynch reduces the distance of the viewer, so you don't get to have this safety, is this just fantastic scene where Jeffrey has finally snuck into the apartment. He's in the closet. It's sort of an archetypal neo-noir, what they're called, the slants in the closet door. And we, the viewer, get to have
the chiaroscuro lighting from the slots. Yeah.
And we, the viewer, get to have this little pornographic, voyeur moment of we get to see the thing. But then, a minute later, she's holding a knife to arguably the viewer, right? Saying, now you have to be the thing that I just was. So we're confronted with
Yeah.
our own desire, and then we have to take the place of arguably the cinematic victim, and it's a
Yeah.
strange reversal. And he just does this all the time. He puts you in.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like you can't. I think I say somewhere in that book, like Lynch forces you to touch the screen, right? Like you can't watch a Lynch film from a safe distance. That seems like to me like the archetypal instance of that, right? Where you feel like, okay, we're safe, we're in the closet, and then he has to come, and then later she forces him to do to her what Frank, she's like, hit me, Jeffrey, hit me, and that's horrible. And then when she's on the lawn, of course, that's one of the worst scenes in the history of cinema to watch. And she's like, naked, you put your disease in me, and his girlfriend is right there. It's like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, it's just terrible. So, yeah, I think that's, I think he really does that. Yeah, to put us in the film.
I mean, but that scene that you mentioned, which is like again archetypal normality. You've got these American muscle cars. You've got the jocks about to have the fight. You've got the guy, Jeffrey and his gal, right, roped up. Like we're gonna throw down in front of the quintessential American house. And as you describe it, like what begins as a sort of white pale dot right on which again in a cinema would probably be far better. Arrives as sort of kind of ghoulish, beaten Dorothy, and like just completely stops the scene. But this is a key Lynchian scene because I think this is why do we keep watching? Why do we want to watch this? There's something very Freudian, which is kind of obvious, but it's very Freudian about, ultimately, Lynch is a director of the death drive, right? Like, I don't want to be here, but it's like a car crash. I'm going to slow down, and I'm going to regret looking, but I know I'm going to look. Yeah. So why do we stay?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just named it. I mean, it's interesting too, isn't it? That I just wanted to point out what gets said right when Dorothy appears. Mike, Sandy's boyfriend, goes, "Who's that? Your mother?" You're like, what? What kind of a line is that to say? I mean, it's just like the craziest thing, and it like does fit this whole Oedipal dynamic that got set up when he was watching Dorothy and Frank. But I think we can't help but watch because just like you're saying, like there's something ineluctable about what Lynch is showing us. Like it's precisely because it doesn't fit within our ordinary reality, but at the same time it's what that ordinary reality relies on, right? Like it's always like driving it, hidden within it, and animating it. So I think that point, I mean, I think our desire is driven by some impossible point, right, that we can't ever get to, and Lynch is in a way allowing us to get to it, like allowing us to get to this thing that is in ordinary life we can't access, we can't see. And so this comes back to this miracle idea. Like I think he really, you get access to this kind of moment of transcendent beyond. Like Dorothy's in a beyond moment there, right? She just doesn't fit. It's like something that's just completely out of the scene, and yet you're like, oh, wait a minute, but there's something about that seems appropriate. Like its horrifyingness is not like a horror movie, right? I think it's really interesting. I mean, no one would say Blue Velvet's a horror movie, and yet that's one of the most horrifying scenes in the history of cinema. So I find that really interesting.
And Frank Booth as well is one of the most horrifying films.
Horrifying. Yeah. But no one would say Blue Velvet's a horror movie. No.
Well, no. Well, I think without like abiding on a typical cliche beyond horror, because horror movies rely on delaying the reveal of the monster, and then you're like, oh, it's it's like Scooby-Doo stuff, right? Like mask off. Oh, it's and for Lynch, like we're going, right at the start of again, father's dead, authority figure is dead. You're not really that safe, and we're going into here, and there's a shit ton of horrible cockroaches, and you can't escape the audio.
Right. But you can see it. I think that's the thing, right? You can see it, you can hear it, you have access to that monster.
Absolutely.
From the beginning. and the monster is us. I think that's the other thing. Like, it's not like, don't you think horror so often the monster is this alien force that's different than us? But Lynch is always this. I mean, like Frank Booth. Okay, no one feels like they're Frank Booth, but you still kind of have this. Everyone feels an attraction to him. I think, like, oh, there's something about him that's pretty cool.
Well, the thing with Frank Booth is that he's so. I mean, and Lynch does this, and Lynch's casting is basically perfect. And I want to mention Carl McLachlan in a minute. But again, with Willem Dafoe as Bobby Peru, the worst of the worst, almost to the degree of like a cartoon caricature of underground evil, like the teeth, and then with the oxygen mask. What's the first thing that Frank Booth says that if any other script did it, just wouldn't work? But it's Lynch. Does he say like, "Call me fucking daddy"? Okay, he says, "Daddy, fucker." Yeah, exactly. Right. So his first thing on screen is like, "This guy is horrendous," but this is the idea of the monster.
Or like he screams out, "I'll fuck anything that moves." Like, what does that even mean? I mean, it's like.
But this is the thing: is the monster is right, the monster or the villain or whoever is right in front of us, and yet if it was a horror film, that feeling would be dissipated because we'd see, oh, it's a clown, it's an alien, it's whatever. The feeling just ramps up because even when you're seeing it right there, you're not actually dealing with the problem. That's like what you would refer to in your book as like the impossible object, which is kind of like abstractly is behind the viewer.
Right.
Like, what's this other thing? So what is the monster? The monsters ourselves. I mean, can you expand on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the we're drawn to that excess in the monster figure in the Lynch film, and that we see. Like, I think to me the three great ones are. I mean, Bob obviously in Twin Peaks is a pretty great example because he's so horrifying, and so maybe there's four. And then Frank Booth, obviously, and then Mr. Eddie in Lost Highway, and then I think Baron Harkonnen in Dune is such a great figure too, and especially because he has this grotesque face, and this is what I think is so interesting, that the grotesqueness of these figures doesn't. And I think most of us think like, oh, if something is grotesque, it's unappealing to us, right? Mm-hmm. We just obvious. I mean, this seems obvious, but Lynch his idea is like, no, their grotesqueness is actually integral to their appeal because it shows it's like they're teeming with this excess of a capacity to enjoy themselves. Like Frank Booth, and I think this is why people like him because he really like Kyle McLaughlin or Jeffrey Beaumont, he like drinks Heineken. He's like a normal bourgeois guy, but Frank Booth, man, he drinks Pabst Blue Ribbon. He says fuck. He does all these perverse acts. Like Mr. Eddie, he beats the crap out of drivers that I mean, everybody wants to do what he does, right? Like somebody tailgates you want to pull over and pistol whip that guy in the face. But you don't do it because, you're a good citizen or whatever. But I think, and Baron Harkonnen, there's this seeping wounds on his face. And he has this doctor who goes, I was just rewatching Dune, who goes, your wounds, love to me. I mean, what is that? What kind of statement is that? But I think it's like that kind of, what we love is that excess of them. And I think to get back to horror a little bit, I think what so many horror monsters lack is that excess. Like they're just kind of, all that they are is mysterious. And I think what Lynch says is, no, my horror is going to be excessive and in your face and unavoidable.
Well, when I discussed horror with on another podcast, the theology of horror, and one thing that was mentioned by Ryan Duns on that the guest was that when you take something like Hellraiser, the Cenobites say, Pinhead says like, we're going to make you feel to your nerve endings. So their transgression is like just repeated, like it's just going to be pain, it's going to be torture. Whereas as you said with Lynch, with the miracle, this thing that's arriving from elsewhere, I mean that's almost in the inverse, that their horror is something, again, is something else entirely. But I want to add in, because of this notion that you said about the two worlds, is that we can't I don't think the viewer can stay there too long. Maybe that's like, because I had this sort of the same thing with Wild at Heart. I didn't turn it off the first time, but I remember being exhausted.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why, because he doesn't control it. I don't know where the valve is in Wild at Heart. So this is why I wanted
Well,
to...
I think James, I would say about Wild at Heart, I think it almost doesn't do this. Like, I don't think it has that other world.
Exactly.
I think it just has been purely in this world of like fantasy and excess. And so this exhaustion, I think that is the proper response to Wild at Heart, because I think you're just so in it that you never get this respite of this other world. And then it just, it's just, it's exhausting. I mean, I now find merits in it, and I think, because I think I think Wild at Heart is a kind of diagnosis of our contemporary world. I think like the way we're on the verge of like being a psychotic society, right? Like where people no longer have a symbolic coordinates to bond them together, and all they have are their little isolated psychotic worlds. And I think that and the fire, of course, represents that too.
I mean, and the thing is, I mean, one thing that you hone in on, which I was actually listening to on my walk on repeat before doing this, just because I thought it'd be a funny thing to do, which is the tracks Power Mad by Slaughterhouse, right? Which begins with like this dun 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 and build, like, it's a real build up song, and then when they go dancing is, I think, the first time you finally hear, which is just one of the most ridiculous metal riffs of all time. That builds about 3 times. You'd think this can't get faster and more intense, and it does.
It does.
But this is the thing, you're thrown into this film with, again, begins just with the words, Wild at Heart with the flame. Doesn't have that opening thing. The opening thing is like, here's this guy, Sailor, and here he is smashing a man's brains out his head immediately to Power Mad playing. And then, so you don't have anything to grab onto. And what I find interesting is the first thing you kind of have to grab onto in that film when he leaves, like, I need some data about this guy. Yeah. Is he, like snakeskin jacket, right? So all we have is him transparently saying, my snakeskin jacket is a symbol of my, and he reels that off, right? As like,
he says that. How many times do we say that? Like 4 or 5 times,
My snakeskin jacket is a symbol of my independence and freedom, or something like that.
My individuality.
Your individuality, right? So he's defeated himself. So what do we have to hold on to at all? Nothing? Yeah. Is there anything in that film?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that, like, the fact that he identifies it with his individuality is really important, right? Because it's like, he just does it. There's just no social connection whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I think that really, I mean, until there is this kind of conversion he undergoes at the end, I think, when this very Wizard of Oz like Glenda comes to him, and I think, because I think he says some kind of slur to all these guys, and they're going to beat him up, and then he does have this kind of moment, I think, of conversion. So maybe there's something at the end, but it doesn't. It takes a long time to come, and Lula isn't really. She's about in his same position, I think. She certainly supports what he's doing.
Yeah, you don't really feel safe. I mean, this is the thing this is why I wanted to mention Carl Kachlan as a casting choice. Is I don't think Twin Peaks or Blue Velvet could work, because he's one of the few actors I feel safe with.
I know. I think. I would imagine how bad Blue Velvet would be if Nicolas Cage played it. I like Nicolas Cage fine, but he would be terrible in Blue Velvet.
You need like the stop valve. I mean, he's so straight. Right? He's so straight laced that you feel so, like he has a connection to normality that just doesn't seem to go any way, and it's an innocence that runs through it as well, right, that you have to go back to. And Twin Peaks works the same way. Like, you go into these little zones, and then you come back out, and you're like, oh, I get to have a bit of time with donuts and coffee, and I need this release.
Yeah.
What do you think that safety is in a Freudian sense, like the ego?
I don't know if it's the ego. I mean, I think it's like I guess I would put it back in these terms that I was using before, of like, okay, now I'm like out of this kind of world of like excess and fantasy, and I'm back in this world where I'm not bombarded with things anymore, right? Like I'm just in the world of lacking and desiring, and I'm not in this world of total excess. And I think that's what Kyle MacLachlan kind of gives us in both of those in all those films, even in Dune, I think.
You really want to mention Dune, don't you? I mean,
Yeah, I
look,
love
Austria, a
Dune,
lot
man.
of people, and you mentioned this in your book, and this was one of the ones that I didn't watch. A lot of people say it isn't a Lynchian,
Yeah, they're wrong.
film.
They're wrong.
Is that just because it doesn't deal with like suburbia, or it doesn't deal with LA?
Like, here's what I would say to them, and I think Lynch is wrong about his own film. And I mean, I'm sorry he didn't have final cut, but I think it's long enough. He was pissed it wasn't longer.
It's meant to be like 4. He wanted it like
Yeah, it'd be like
4
4 hours. It's long enough. It's fine. I feel like it does. It is one like he for one thing. If you watch that and then watch these, I like Denis Villeneuve a lot, but these films are not good compared to Lynch's film, because he takes out all the best parts, and one of the best parts is when we get this revelation by Paul that the worms are the spice, right? Like and I think to me that's the greatest Lynchian moment, is that the thing that is the great danger that will destroy us is at the same time the thing of the ultimate salvation, right? Like that, like what, like the worms are the spice is the worm. Like that is to me, that's like it's this incredible, and then Paul goes, Father, the sleeper has awakened. And like the way awakening is this moment of like this recognition. So I feel like it's incredible. It's really, I find it just, I just think it's the perfect Lynch film. I do.
You think it's like his best?
I think it's I think Fire Walk with Me is better. But of course, Fire Walk with Me, it's not really I watched it as a standalone film and I still loved it, but you really have to watch the series first. So I think as a standalone film, it's his best one. Yeah. I know it's such a minority report. Like, but the only, I will say that the one person who agrees with me is Slavoj.
Of course.
Yeah.
It goes without saying, doesn't it?
He absolutely agrees with me. Yeah. It's like when we sit together and talk, that's the first thing. We have a little discussion of Dune, and then we talk about other stuff.
So just to, really hone in on a definition of the Lynchian as per your book, The Impossible, David Lynch. The impossible for you is desire prior to fantasy. So we are somehow...
Right, because you can never have that. You can never have... No, you can never have desire prior to fantasy, because fantasy actually structures our desire. So Lynch is creating this impossible situation where you have desire seemingly without any fantasy. And then the impossible thing is when these two worlds actually come together, these moments where they come together, like in that, what I just said from Dune, but in like when it rains in Dune, like that's this moment of the impossible. Like when, in Blue Velvet, when like this moment where, when he encounters Dorothy, right? This is the moment of the impossible. Like he gets thrust onto the stage, right? Like you're just like you're saying, like we're safe, we're not on the stage, we're on the stage. And I feel like those kind of and then in Fire Walk with Me, I think it's this amazing moment where Laura Palmer is about to be killed, and she wouldn't have been killed, but she puts on the ring, which is like this act of resistance against her raping father, and then he kills her in response to that. But it's this ultimate, incredible act of resistance. And so I feel like there are these moments where, and then of course in Straight Story, it's just the whole event, right? It's like he does this impossible. He like travels this incredible distance and in a seemingly impossible way.
But there's a second impossible there that almost when you hadn't really something I thought about until he pointed out in your book. And Wilder High is probably the weirdest example, but the endings of Lynch films are like, without Lynch, they would be just the most like disgustingly cliche. Like, actually, probably the best example would be The Elephant Man, right? Like he gets a round of applause. Basically, that's kind of one ending there, but like he gets he gets arguably his ultimate fantasy fulfilled in the most excessive way. But we're not disappointed as a viewer. It doesn't seem It doesn't seem ridiculous. It doesn't seem like a rom-com happy ending, right? And so that seems to be another impossible that Lynch manages to. But then is that because it's like the classic Freud quote again of like, well, he did succeed, but he's still the alpha man. He's still kind of miserable.
Well, I don't think he is. I mean, I think like isn't it impossible too that he sleeps like a normal person? It kills him. He sleeps like a normal person. And I think he does. I think Lynch does show us these moments where we like totally exceed. And again, I think he shows us the price that we pay for that, which is death or humiliation or whatever, or uncomfortability, disturbance. But I think he does show like these moments of like really going beyond and getting the, realizing the desire. Right. And so I feel like that's, yeah, I think you're right. Isn't it a great point that in the hands of like a hack, it'd be so mawkish and so maudlin. But when Lynch does it, it's just take the Twin Peaks theme, right? Okay. Like I have to admit something. Like when that theme, I think it only plays once or twice in The Return until Kyle MacLachlan awakens as Dale Cooper, right?
Right.
And then it plays, and I have to say, I cried my eyes out. And then the guy goes, "I got to call the FBI," and then Cooper goes, "I am the FBI," and you're like, amazing. It's just amazing, right? And you're like, "Wait a minute, am I for the FBI?" But I think Lynch. Like, that's, again, one of these scenes where you could be like, wow, that's just hackneyed and terrible. But it's like, when Lynch does it, it's like the most incredibly moving thing of all. Like what about else in Twin Peaks, The Return, when Nadine comes along and says, for all these 25 years, I've been a selfish bitch. She goes, well, now I'm giving you my freedom, your freedom, right? Mm-hmm. And you're just like, what? Like, really? Like, somebody has that kind of, she has that conversion because she buys that golden shovel from the doctor, right? It's like the stupid thing, but then you're like, and it's like this incredibly moving scene. Like, someone has this incredible revelation and they totally change. And then one of my favorite scenes also in the series is Ed goes to Norma and says, I have my freedom. Can we get married? And she goes, "Oh, I got to see my boyfriend now." And you're like, "Oh my God." And then he goes, "Can I have a cup of coffee and a tablet of cyanide?" And then she tells the guy, like, "Sell him my stuff. I don't want any more." And then she walks up to him and says, "Yes." And it's like, isn't it like what you're saying? Like, in the hands of anyone else, you'd be like, "Oh, really? Like, Norma and Ed are hooking up after all these years, and that I'm supposed to feel good." But I think you're like, it's incredibly moving.
Yeah, just to throw in my own favorite example of that is Agent Albert, right? When he calls him Truman, Sheriff Truman calls him like, "You knuckle draggers," and he like goes to grab his collar, and then like Albert goes on his speech about like, "I'm on the path of Gandhi and King," right? Like out of nowhere, and talks about his path of love, and then Cooper is like, "Albert's path is a strange one," and like absolutely out of nowhere to explain why this character isn't actually and all of a sudden lots of things happen. Like, now I actually know and feel but that's the main thing. I feel this guy isn't a complete asshole now.
I know.
I have, but in an instant, anyone else, you'd be like, that is the worst betrayal of like show don't tell imaginable. And yet, why? Like, so I mean, do you have any theories of why Lynch was able to be like, yeah, and then we're just going to do that, and it works? Like,
it works totally. I know, and you're like, and I'm speaking to you universally. Your view of Albert totally changes, right? Like, you're just like, I mean, you still think he's kind of rude and impolite, but you really like him, and I think he's able. And you're right, he violates the show don't tell thing all the time. And I think it's because he's able to do it because I think you could only do it with that kind of absolute reversal, right? Like, and I think it has to do with this, like, bringing together things that are absolutely disparate, and that's why it works. Like if Albert just said, what if he said, I've had a hard life, and I've like,
Oh,
it's caused me to be a little rude, and I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have acted the way. But he goes like, wait, great.
but he's prepared it. It's just like literally like he's prepared it, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's the thing. That's why it works, is because it's such a collision of things you don't expect, you know?
Hmm. Okay, well, one thing I want to ask you, because the words thrown around, we've probably already, completed. What do you, when someone says that's lynchian, do you have a go-to definition?
Yeah, I do. And I it's interesting because I think people say that as much as they say that's Kafkaesque, right? Like, I think those are the two. And I think that there's a real, I think that first I'll answer your question. I just say it's bizarrely normal. That's what lynchian is. But I think the Kafka thing I find very interesting, because I think both, Kafka is a very readable writer, right? Like, he's not James Joyce. And I think, and yet there's this incredible complexity there. And I think Lynch is the same. Like so we talk about Lynch, like, he's this independent filmmaker who can make films that are really appealing to the mainstream too. So I think that there's something, I think that kind of artist comes around once every, 100 years, 50 years. I mean, I think it's a real rarity to have someone who can really like bring together like like the art cinema or art literature and then the popular. Like, I think it's just, I just think the degree of difficulty is so high. I think there are great popular directors. Like, I think Kubrick, for instance, I think Michael Mann's a great popular director. I think Spike Lee's a great popular director, but they're not art. I mean, they're not making like surrealist cinema in a way that Lynch is. So I think that's,
Yeah, I mean,
no, yeah.
well, sorry, but just to use like probably the most obvious example, because it's the one when I go into Lynch, it was via David Foster Wallace, who was talking about in his famous essay, and then talking about Blue Velvet.
Yeah.
But like, to think that something such as Blue Velvet, that has this scene where a guy has died, the yellow man, but he's just stood there, and
Yeah.
that is given as to be accepted as a whatever.
Yeah.
To think that would be a popular film is it's odd to think about.
It's hard to think about. I know. Yeah. I just think he's, again, I think it's maybe all the things we've talked about, right? Like, the fact that he's able to like tap into the normality while showing the bizarre within it. I think that's enough to appeal to people, to give him a chance, who otherwise just want to see something. I mean, I think the other thing is, I think it's a credit. I think his popularity is a kind of a credit to hoi polloi or something, like I think we tend to denigrate the garden variety person, or people that I hang out with. And I think like the fact that he's so popular among people that are just not necessarily cinephiles or professors or whatever, I think is a credit to people's ability to be interested in what challenges them, because he challenges people.
Yeah. It's a fairly open question, because you mentioned a little bit the ethics earlier, which is a strange aspect of Lynch's films. This is very, very open. Do you think he's an optimist or a pessimist? I mean, I know that's extremely open. It's not really.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, James, because I think I clearly he wants to confront the dark side, right? So in that sense, there's a certain pessimism, but I think I guess I want to come back to this line from Dune, that the worms are the spice. Like, I think he wants to say, in the thing that's the most horrible, we can have this greatest, like Laura Palmer suffers some of the worst things a person ever suffered, right? And yet she is capable of these incredible moments of transcendence when the Twin Peaks theme plays, right? Like, that's when in that series, when we're having a moment of transcendence, there's this we're all of a sudden, okay, we're out of, like, we've transcended something. Even I don't know about you, but even it's one of the few series where I never skip the credit sequence because I just love the song so much that
It's
I can.
very satisfying, very crisp.
Yeah,
And the visuals of the saw.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. Like, is a sawmill transcendent? Probably not. But like the way Lynch shoots it, you're like, yeah. So I feel like he's able to take the darkest things and find some kind of absolute hope in them. And I think that that's, so I guess my answer is optimistic. I mean, I think that that's the final answer for me.
You think characters in Lynch's worlds are all within the same world, but one could be in hell, one could be in heaven.
Yeah.
But within the same place, though.
Yeah. I mean, don't you think so much comes back to the radiator lady singing in heaven, everything is fine, right? Like, I think like that transcendence that she offers for Henry Spencer, who's in about his situation's almost as bad as Laura Palmer's. I think that that's something he thinks is available to all his characters throughout. I mean, maybe not it's funny because I think maybe not these obscene villain figures, right? Because I think they don't.
They're set in stone. They're not redeemable.
Yeah, they're not redeemable. So they don't. I mean, they're appealing, as we've talked about, but I don't think they ever have. Like, they never have a moment of. I mean, Baron Harkonnen flies out the roof when he dies, but they don't have a moment of transcendence like every other character does, I think. So that is interesting. I think that the ones that are more excessive are the ones that are also more tied to Earth.
Yeah, he's a Christian, like you said, he's a Christian filmmaker.
He's a Christian filmmaker. Yeah.
Have you written on that? Is that something you've expanded?
No, I haven't written on that. I might. I'm tempted. I don't know if I'll do it, but I have essays on the stuff that's not in the book, and I've been tempted to put out another edition. I don't know. It's just it's work, and I got things. I just have other, as the French say, I have other cats to whip. So I don't know. I don't know if I'll do it.
So I think I already know the answer. Where would you advise people to begin with Lynch?
To begin,
see, Dune wouldn't work. That Dune wouldn't.
No. I wouldn't say Dune. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I wouldn't say Dune at all. I would say to begin. I think is Lost Highway too hard? I'm tempted to say Lost Highway. I guess I think the right answer is probably Blue Velvet. Right. That's probably the right answer.
There isn't one that, because you could go there and then you say, okay, I'll go back to Elephant Man, and you'd be like, hang on. But then they go back another one, and you're in Eraser, right? So there is already one that Blue Velvet's like the make it like a.
I think Blue Velvet's the safest choice. I think a lot of people. I think the problem with Mulholland as a choice, which I think is also pretty good. I think it's so great that it could set you up for some disappointment in the rest, like it. And it's a little bit more polished, I think, than the other ones. So,
and it's got to be spoiled, because if you then get into David Lynch, I think you'd be thankful if that was left.
I think I agree.
We didn't mention that. And I had one. Mulholland was one of the ones I rewatched. And even I love horror films, and I know all the jump scares. Of all the films, the one jump scare that still I can go back 10 seconds in the film and it will still get me is the diner scene, man. That is just one of the best scenes ever filmed.
Yeah, the guy who recounts the dream, who if I ever see that in real life, he there's an interview with him about Lynch, and he's also in The Return. There's an interview with him recently in Vulture magazine. It's kind of interesting. So yeah.
Oh, wow. What's he? He's talking about Mulholland Drive?
Yeah, he just talks about Mulholland, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that's an incredible. That film is terrifying, I think. I mean, even I have to say, even the scene where the guy is drinking the coffee and spits it out, I find that. Yeah. Oh God.
The one that stood out to me on a rewatch is when she first moves to the house. I can't remember the woman who owns its name, but she talks to her through a screen for the first minute, and it's just horribly unnerving. Where the coffee scene is also awful, and they have to like apologize for the espresso.
I know.
Yeah, it's claustrophobic.
Yeah, it really is. And then, yeah, I mean, there's so much. I think you're right. Like, you want to have that one to look forward to if you're watching Lynch. You don't want to start with that.
And some of them, I mean, it's got to be said, some of the most erotic sex scenes.
Oh, I think it's
and
one
it's
of the.
it's not even. It's arguably not even pornographic. It is erotic.
Oh, I don't think it is at all. I mean, I don't think it's one of these like heterosexual man shoots lesbians, like whatever pornography. I don't think that at all. I mean, every lesbian friend I have thinks it's a great depiction of lesbian love. So, and I think that's true. So, yeah, I think it's his best love story, just unquestionably. What would be better?
I was thinking, well, for some reason my mind went to Lucy and
Andy.
Hey, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But is that too Is that too?
They're a little. Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I can see that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly. I mean, the one thing you can say about that is he shows the complexities of their relationship more than he does. But they're so kind of inane. I feel like that.
Yeah.
Whereas Rita or whatever her name is, and Betty there really is a sense of their, like, the depth of their love. And then that scene, I mean, the scene at Silencio is just with Rebecca Del Rio, who asked him, she wanted to be in the film, and what an amazing performance that was, I think. Yeah.
What's I'm probably not the best place to. Do you think Lynch ever had a failure? Is there a thing where you think? I mean, season 2. I guess season 2 is the common one to go to, but there's a lot of directorial.
Yeah, I think season 2 is fine at Twin Peaks. I think Inland Empire is basically a failure.
Really?
I don't. I mean, I wrote a pretty long essay on it, defending it, but I kind of was too generous, I think, just because I like, I do that a lot. I wrote a book on Christopher Nolan, and I defended all the Batman films, and I'm kind of like, I shouldn't have done that. But yeah, I think Inland Empire doesn't have that much going for it. Like, I think speaking of what we were talking about, I think it gets lost in this fantasy world, and like even more than Wild at Heart, and doesn't give us any kind of rooting. There's just you're launched, and then you're in, and then it just you're spiraling in. And I have a colleague, Dia Jung, who thinks that's why it's his best film. But I used to say it's either his best film or his worst film, and I no longer say that. No, I just think.
Well, there's something to. I mean, you mentioned actually in our last chat that your annoyance at like freeform poetry.
Yeah.
Right. Like, there's creativity needs limits, and
yes, absolutely, right. And I think it's not an accident that it was his first film made on digital. So there was no, the problem with digital is there's no money constraint on how much you shoot, right? Like, I mean, that's the great thing about film is, sorry, you can't keep shooting because you don't have an infinite amount of money. And I think that's a really good. I think Lynch needed that constraint. Yeah. He needed that constraint, and he didn't have it, and it made the film worse. I mean, I think it's I think the effect of digital on cinema has been very nefarious for the reason we're just this limit problem that we're just talking about now.
Yeah, I was looking at the runtime, like average. Yeah, like you said last time.
No, it's just incredible. Like I want to see The Brutalist, but I'm not going to go. It's like 3 hours and 20 minutes. And I said to my students, they're like, "Oh, it's okay. There's an intermission." I'm like, "That's worse." I said, "At least I want the film to keep going when I go out to the bathroom, so more of it's over." I mean, it's like, I don't know if I can go. I mean, it's just.
I'll tell this because it's like the only time I get to tell this story. I waited to see 2001: Space Odyssey, and when it was shown, and I was like, "Yeah, this is gonna be great, right?" And it has the intermission. First half was amazing. I was like, "This is incredible." Went out to the bar, like to the bathroom. I came back in and someone sat in front of me. I bought a hot dog with onions, and like so, the second half of the film is just ruined for me now because I was like, great, like I could just smell this hot dog. And also from then on, I'm like, no intermissions, just hold it in. Yeah. I can do it.
Yeah, I am just totally against the intermission. Our twin boys. We took them. They were probably too young. They were like 14 to Lawrence of Arabia, which is over 4 hours. And the intermission comes after 3, and they're like, and it comes the side comes to intermission. They're like, the one turns to me and goes, "You've got to be fucking kidding me!" Exact quote. And I said, "Just hang in there, man." But yeah, I think the intermission is a bad. But yeah, I mean, just make the film shorter. Like, I just think film noir. Lynch is a good example. Like most of his Mulholland's long, but most of his films are under 2 hours. I just think film noir is a great example. I mean, most film noir is a tight 90 minutes. It's right there, And I just think that there's something to be said for
Mulholland moves pretty fast, though.
It does. No one feels like it's 2.5 hours.
Wild at Heart doesn't, though. That's all.
It feels like a long movie.
Slog, man. You get to about an hour and 20 in that, and you're kind of bored of Sailor and Lula.
I know. Because it's basically the same.
How many times?
I mean, road movies are hard. They're hard. There's barely been a good road movie. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, long live David Lynch. Is your book still in print?
It is still in print. Yeah.
And you're gonna updated version, revised.
Let's hope. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know. People have asked me to do it in honor of this thing, but I don't know.
All right. Well, Todd McGowan, again.
How much of my life I feel like I have left? I'll see you. Great talking.
Thank you very much, man.